Good evening and welcome back to 31 Horror Nights. It's October 29th and tonight's movie is Suspiria, the remake. Bet you weren't expecting this. Or maybe were, I don't know your mind. Anyway, I knew going into this that Suspiria was a big deal, and since I hadn't seen the original or the remake, I figured that I might as well knock both out in 1 month. I looked up what else this director has done, and he turns out to be no slouch. He directed this one movie you might have heard of called Call Me By Your Name. Yeah, starring Lil Nas X and everything. The cast is pretty star-studded as well. The two leads are Dakota Johnson and Tilda Swinton, both of which have worked with this director in the past. The score was also composed by Tom York, who you might know better as the lead singer of Radiohead. The biggest difference between the two movies, just from the trailer, is how the new one looks compared to the original. The original movie was so colorful. This movie has a lot more standard of a horror movie color palette. It's all very washed out, gray, not that bright. But there is still some creative artisticness in a lot of the makeup and costume design. Another difference is that this movie is a lot longer than the original. The original Suspiria was about 100 minutes. This is 2.5 hours. Unlike most horror remakes, the reception to this was not negative. It was more mixed to positive. Which, considering how the first movie was about 90% colors, I think is kind of surprising. I'm gonna go check it out and see what it's like for 2.5 hours. Okay, I have seen the remake of Suspiria, and I'm gonna give it the same score I gave the original, 7 out of 10, but these are two different 7 out of 10s. Suspiria, the original, was a lot more consistent. This movie has higher highs and lower lows. As previously stated, the most striking difference between the two movies is the way that they look. The original is very vibrant and colorful. This one is not really either of those things, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a lot of aesthetic in this movie. With the original, it was all about color theory and sets. In this one, it's more about cinematography and editing. Watching this movie made me realize that in a lot of ways, Suspiria is very standard and traditional in the way that it presents itself. I would not say the same thing about the 2018 Suspiria. The editing in this movie is very quick. Even in scenes where not a lot is happening, it'll cut back and forth really fast. And when scenes when there is a lot of happening, there'll be like 2 or 3 shots in the span of a second. And that really works in this movie's favor at some points. There's this big dance scene towards like the end of the second act where the editing is so fast. I can only imagine how long it took to bring that scene together, but it all works. Conversely, there are also a lot of long shots in this movie. Ones that will follow people around, ones that will like come down from the air. They'll also do other things like play with motion smears and frame rates and stuff like that. This all comes off as a lot more art house than the original. And while the acting is good, the overall characterization I didn't think was as good as the original movie. This Susie I like significantly less than the first one. But, on the other hand, the horror is, I think, executed a lot better here. Both movies have quite a doozy of a first death, but the remake held nothing back. I think which one you'll prefer ultimately boils down most of it to a stylistic choice. Both of these are similar movies, basically the same concept, but the original is a lot more of a traditional take, and the new one is a lot more modernized and art house. And the stories aren't that different except for the way that they end, but that'll have to wait for the spoiler section. Overall, I can see why people would like the remake of Suspiria just fine, and I can also see why people would hate it compared to the original, because the main thing that made the original so unique, the colors, is gone. And I can also see how the ending of the remake can be sort of make or break it for people. For me, it kind of balanced out. There are some things that the remake did better, some things that the original did better. I don't particularly love either movie, but I don't mind either of them. If you held me down and made me choose one, I would say that I like the original probably a little bit better, but I don't think the remake is bad. Now I want to talk about the spoilers. Most of the big differences in the stories of these two movies is that I think the remake is banking on the fact that you at least know the plot of the original. In the 1977 version, you learn things along with the characters, but there's a lot more, like, going back and forth from different viewpoints in the remake. Pretty much from the beginning, you know that this is a coven. And you can tell that they're looking for this perfect dancer's sacrifice to be used as a new vessel. One thing I did notice about this movie that made it different from the original is that the Dance Academy in the 77 version was co-ed. There were men and women in it. And this one, it's all women. I don't know what, if anything, to make of that. The key difference is in how it all ends. In the original, Susie defeats the headmistress, Marcos, and wins. She destroys the school, all the other witches die, and it's a relatively happy ending. In this one, it's a lot more mixed. It's kind of confusing, and it took me a few reading of articles to fully grasp what exactly they were trying to get across. But as it turns out, the witch that's the head of this academy is not who she says she is. There's talk of these 3 primordial witches. One of them is, I think it was Suspiriorum, who the headmistress is saying that she's like the incarnation of. But in fact, the actual incarnation of this mother witch was Susie. That part of her awakens and she uses her newfound powers and summons this thing, this really gnarly looking ghoulish monster to help slay Marcos and I guess all the witches that were supporting her. There was also this really sad moment in the wrap-up of the movie. One of the main characters in this movie is a psychologist who is a man but is played by Tilda Swinton, who I would never have guessed was actually a woman in prosthetics until she started talking. Anyway, he feels a lot of guilt about his wife, who he believes to have died, and the witches use that to lure him to the academy so they could kill him. But he does make it out, and Susie/Suspiria, they come to him, and they sort of give him an abbreviated story of how his wife died in a camp, but she didn't have a sad, painful ending. She died thinking of her husband. And that was a really, really good dramatic moment. So, as opposed to the original, where the Academy and the Coven gets destroyed, in this one it just sort of falls under new management. The witch that Susie is now seems to be benevolent, but I don't really know for sure. I do think I prefer the original's more simpler take on this story. Anyway, this movie was kind of a bomb at the box office. It did not make very much money. But I don't think it was significantly better or worse than the original Suspiria, just different. And watching both movies was very interesting because it kind of shows how a director would approach an idea at one point in time and how another director would approach the same idea over 40 years later. To me, both movies were fine. I can understand people have strong feelings about either of them, but they were good. Okay, thanks for listening. I'll see you tomorrow.